Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's RANT webinar. Thank you so much for coming to join us for what promises to be a fantastic look at deception history and its applicability to the cyber realm. We do hope that the sun is shining as well as it is for you where we are in London, and you enjoyed that monumentous display last night as we shot out of the World Cup. But we have some great news in that Mr. Tony Cole, the CTO of Ativo Networks, has come to join us and share some fascinating information with us. A couple of very small bits before we get started. We are going to be encouraging any questions that you'd like to ask for Tony or the Ativo team throughout the presentation, so please do feel free to write those in at any time. We'll try and get around to them during the presentation, but if not, any that we miss we'll be dealing with at the end. Next up, we've got a bunch of really interesting attachments which you can find on the right-hand side of the presentation that will give you a little bit more background on Ativo Networks. So please feel free to go and have a look at those at your convenience and download them. Finally, and with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Tony Cole, CTO of Ativo Networks. Over to you, Tony.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. If you're in the UK, sorry about your loss in the World Cup. I know that's a tough thing to battle through. I'm a big hockey fan myself, and my team finally won their championship, the Washington Capitals, for the first time since the team was founded 44 years ago. So I understand the pain. Well, thank you for joining us today. So this hopefully will be very interesting to you. And as Tom stated, we're going to talk about deception history and its applicability to the cyber realm. And let's jump right in and get started. The agenda today, we're going to look at what is deception, how it's worked in the past, deception today, the growing cyber attack problem. Much of us know that already, but nevertheless, I think it's worth focusing on for a minute. Deception in the cyber realm, why it's applicable, to the cyber realm, and why we should have been doing it for quite some time now and had not been in the past. So the first topic, what is deception? I had to use some quotes here on each one of my agenda slides. Kind of fun. This is an interesting one because there's a long history of deception across the world where it's been very, very applicable and had significant successes in the physical world in all kinds of different areas, obviously the military being one. Let's talk about that a little bit. Deception, what is deception? I think everybody, probably knows around the world what deception is, but sometimes we don't think about it, from the perspective of who is deceiving us and how frequently we're being deceived. Quite literally, in most places around the world, if you watched a television show last night and saw an advertisement or advert, you'll know that you were deceived. If you stop and think about it, you're deceived. Here in the U.S., we have a tremendous amount of pharmaceutical commercials, and it's quite funny as they talk about how wonderful your life can be. Very fine print at the bottom, and sometimes with a very quiet sub thing in the back going with audio. They're talking about all the different ways these drugs can kill you. Although they may solve one specific problem, they could kill you in a number of other ways. So it's really interesting, the deception that we go through on a regular basis. So, but quite literally, deception is nothing more than the act of deceiving someone. So a thing that deceives, a range of elaborate deceptions. So, and it goes all the way from a light deception all the way to, complete and utter treachery. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Some of the structured uses of deception today, and if you notice, I have two relatively famous buildings up there, so Whitehall and the Pentagon in the United States. So because military uses deception a lot, and we'll touch on that one in a minute as well. So, but they truly use subterfuge in the case of disguise and disguised movement. So cover and concealment is another term for that. So when you're talking about with individual troops where they literally hide or intend to look like the environment around them, that is literally deception. So propaganda, that's been very famous for many, many years, where one side or another will actually utilize propaganda through a number of different methods, including over-the-air radio broadcasts, so dropping pamphlets, so in a number of other fashions as well. Misinformation falls within that as well, so you can kind of tie those two together. military secrets. We're going to talk about a few of those cases as well. That one's very, very interesting. For instance, if somebody cracks radio code encryption that you have during a war and you know they've cracked it, well, then you can feed them false information. So it's a lot of tactics where deception's used in the military side. And of course, false flag. That's a very interesting one where you do something and pretend to be someone else. For instance, the primary physical case in recent times probably were the Russian troops in the Ukraine. So they were claiming they weren't Russian troops. Instead, they were just good Russian nationals with Ukrainian backgrounds that wanted to help the Russian ethnic background folks in the Ukraine. So very, very interesting. False flag today we see a lot in the cyber realm, and we'll touch on that one a little bit later too, where someone will enact a campaign, so compromise someone and pretend to be a different organization, whether that's a nation state pretending to be organized crime or a nation state pretending to be a different nation state. We see a lot of both, and sometimes we even see organized crime pretending to actually be a nation state. How it's worked in the past. We can get a little bit deeper here. I think it's really, really interesting to do a deep dive on deception in the past, but that's beyond this webinar. Simply put, that could and probably is a number of different courses in colleges and universities around the globe, because there's a tremendous amount of cases where deception's been successful in the past. One of my favorite quotes: "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we first practice to deceive." So that's from the Strategicon. And it's a great one. I know it's well known in the UK. Some first known deceptions. I think this is a really important area for us. Obviously the Trojan War, where Odysseus supposedly crafted a giant wooden horse, in the image of the emblem of the city of Troy, and filled it with thousands of armed men. He told the Trojan leaders his gift was an offering to the goddess Athena, whose temple had been destroyed by the Greeks, so they accepted that gift, rolled it in, and supposedly was packed full of soldiers, which, came out in the middle of the night and massacred the city and took over. Pretty famous case of deception, still well known today around the globe. The next one is Alexander the Great. So really, really interesting. Alexander the Great was trying to actually cross the westernmost river of the Punjab region. There was another general on the other side battling him. It's a very long story, but nevertheless fascinating, where this General Porus saw Alexander trying to cross the river and knew if he crossed the river, more than likely he would get beat. But he knew he could actually impact him significantly by stopping him from crossing the river. So wherever Alexander's troops moved back and forth and tried to cross the river, Porus actually matched them back and forth with his soldiers, so to ensure they would be attacked and killed. So Alexander, brilliant strategist that he was, he deceived him simply by actually having troops move back and forth across the river continuously, a very small contingent. So Porus's troops, over a long period of time, got kind of complacent, watching those troops move back and forth up and down the river and stopping them at each place. What they didn't pay any attention to was Alexander moved his entire main force and crossed the river at another point, attacked Porus, and slaughtered most of the forces. So you can see that's a famous deception case, where just simply some trickery, it resulted in the difference in a battle. Hannibal Barca, so another famous one, actually a couple cases. Lake Trasimene, probably the most famous one. So where they chased Hannibal to a north shore of Lake Trasimene, where they thought he was actually retreating. But in the middle of the night, Hannibal had sent men miles ahead to light campfires, so making trying to remember the Roman general Flamininus, so believed that Hannibal's forces were far away. But he had tricked them by having those soldiers light campfires way off in the distance. That's not where Hannibal's forces were. So instead, Hannibal ambushed Flamininus's force, taking them in the flank and trapping them in a kill box, and wiped out half of a 30,000-man army while only losing 2,500 soldiers of his own. He was outnumbered. So, but again, deception by planting those campfires, making the other general think his troops are far away, is what allowed him to actually to win. So one of the other great things he did was he actually spread his troops out at Cannae in 216 BC, and also defeated a very, very strong force, so of 80,000, so compared to Hannibal's force of 50,000. And all he did was he wrapped his line very, very thin, so when the other force attacked, it looked like they were actually overrun, but in reality, he'd spread his force out and just built a big box around him, collapsed, and destroyed the force. So, and in fact, he really invented the concept of annihilation all through deception. So really interesting, some of the great military leaders in the past and what they were able to do by simply implementing deception during battle. Some of the more successful ones in a little bit closer times. So Genghis Khan, I know that still was quite a while ago, but still very, very interesting. Genghis Khan, so did a battle along the Kalka River in the Ukraine. So between 80,000 Russians and 20,000 of Genghis Khan's mounted raiders. So you think about a difference there of 60,000 people. So anyway, the Russians assembled this army and were chasing Genghis Khan, and same type of concept. So Genghis Khan just seemed to be keeping just barely ahead of the Russians. So, and the whole time he was actually setting up a trap, deceived him, making him think he was on the run, and instead they created also what the military calls a kill box, so, and completely decimated those Russian troops. Very interesting. So the Russians did somewhat of a similar thing during the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. So they used the same tactics the Allies did at Normandy, and we'll talk about that one in a second. But Stalin sent out fake radio messages in a code he knew the Germans had broken, saying the Russians' forces were weak and failing in the area. So he had fake trenches dug around the city of Stalingrad to make it appear as his infantry was mounting a desperate last stand, and sent scores of his own troops on suicide missions to deliberately lose those small skirmishes with the Germans outside of town. And then once Hitler's confidence was at an all-time high, he committed his entire Russian force to storm Stalingrad in an overwhelming show of force, and he walked right into a major trap. Stalin trapped the Germans in a classic double envelope and accordingly annihilated them. They suffered 850,000 casualties out of over 1 million troops committed. So very, very interesting, and that was one of the single most decisive battles of World War II, which isn't discussed, that frequently. The Ghost Army is one of my favorites and probably very applicable to this audience, since there's a lot of people in the UK on this call. So the Ghost Army, Hitler knew the invasion of Europe was coming, so in World War II. And this is a fascinating one because it's where the Americans and the Brits worked together very, very well, where the British were using secret double agents and passing fake information back to the Germans about where the landing was going to take place during D-Day. And the Americans also working with the Brits, so actually put in place a number of fake encampments, fake tanks, literally blow-up tanks. They had actors who were also part of the military, but they literally were actors that had joined as part of this Ghost Army, so that would show up and would hang out laundry and set up campfires and everything else. So all to make Hitler think that the landing was going to take place somewhere else. So they did a lot during World War II, but that's probably one of the most famous ones, was tricking Hitler into where the landing was going to take place. So a fascinating one. And if you've never read about it, the Ghost Army is a fascinating read. There's a lot of really great books on that. By the way, it's one of my favorite, as a retired Army guy, one of my favorite patches is the Ghost Army patch. It's pretty cool. So famous quote, we can't talk about cybersecurity and the art of warfare and not mention Sun Tzu, so it's kind of a requirement. It's one of my favorite quotes from the art of war. I make the enemy see my strengths as weaknesses and my weaknesses as strengths, while I cause his strengths to become weaknesses and discover where he is not strong. So, and let's talk about deception today. But today, deception is everywhere. We don't think about it very often, but it is literally everywhere. If you connect and you go online, then there's a good chance you're being deceived. We pay to go to a movie to be deceived by cinema. So if you just saw the new Avengers Infinity War, much of that movie is done in CGI. So, but we actually pay for the entertainment to have someone deceive us and make us think something looks and feels real, even though it's not. Gambling is another great one. We go to the casino trying to hit it rich, knowing that, most of the time you're going to lose your money in those machines. They built billion-dollar corporations, and yet people still put their money in those machines, as well as, state and government-run lotteries as well, knowing that those fund massive highway programs, road programs, and yet we still take part in it. Magic is another one. If you've ever been out to Las Vegas or any great magic show, deception and sleight of hand is another tactic that they use. Online, of course, we all know about the U.S. election meddling that got worldwide coverage. So, and the attempts in France and some focus now, we think, on the Germans as well. So, very, very interesting, the everyday deception that we see. I had to toss dating in there. If you follow that, there's cases all the time where somebody is pretending to look one way and then looks another once you actually meet them. So, and fool's gold, of course, is quite a famous one. So government use of deception today, that's also everyday deception. Today we have a number of different regulations out there. So from the U.S. military, so they have a joint publication on military deception that they published in 2012. So NATO has an Allied Joint Doctrine for Special Operations where it talks about deception. And then very interestingly, U.S. NIST, if you don't know them, that's the National Institute of Standards in Technology, so has a 800-53 pamphlet, so that's really, really interesting, that lists out all the recommended security controls. Most of those security controls have flowed into what's called the cybersecurity framework, so that a lot of companies around the globe use. In my travels, I bumped into about 25 nations that are focused on the NIST cybersecurity framework that flows out of 800-53. The point is, the current version is Rev 4, so the draft version today that they're working on right now is Rev 5 and actually calls out deception in a number of security controls in there, recommending that people start implementing deception into their environment. I don't completely agree with all the controls that are in there today, but nevertheless, it's a nice step forward for them to actually start thinking about it. But the point is that it's very interesting that we're starting to see deception now with recommendations in the cyber realm, as well as the continuous use of deception in the physical realm by militaries and many others as well. And obviously, we shouldn't jump off this without also touching on one of the most common places deception is continuously used in is sports. So we don't think about that very often, but nevertheless, for the vast majority of team sports, you literally are building a strategy so to actually do one thing, but make the other team think you're going to do something else. It's how you get a goal in football. It's how you move a team down the field. So in a United States version of football. So it's very, very interesting that we don't think about that, but nevertheless, every coach thinks about that. How do you deceive that other team? So the growing cyber attack problem. This is a really interesting space for me. Back in early 2000s, Google came out with something called Google Alerts. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great product, by the way. And if you've got a Google account, you can simply sit down and create an alert using a little tiny bit of Boolean algebra, so on topics that you want information on. And I created some in my last role where I was focused primarily on government cyber issues around the globe, but looking in critical infrastructure. But creating a rule where, you would say cyber plus breach plus government or breach plus government. And anyway, when that first started, it was very interesting to me. I would get a few emails a day that would talk about different breaches, and this is just in the English language. So in the years leading up to probably about 2013, 2014, I literally had to go through and create a rule inside Outlook so to actually dump those when they came into a specific folder, because they were just stuffing my inbox. So with all of the emails were coming in, literally hundreds of them. And today I've gone through and redefined my rules and cut it way, way down. So the point is, the cyber attack problem is getting much, much worse than it was in the past. So, and I think pretty much everybody knows that. The WannaCry impact in the UK and many others, it's a big challenge for us. So if you're not familiar with the site that I'm bringing up now, it's a lot of fun to go play with. It's very simply, it's called Information is Beautiful. So, and this is the world's biggest data breaches that they've tracked through 2017. So compiling the information based on the number of records lost. So if you look, this is starting at 2004, and I'll just scroll through this, 2006 up through 2008, 2008 up to 2010, 2010 to 2011, headed into 2012, up through 2013, through 2015, all the way up to 2017. So you can see that what I was talking about with my Google Alerts that I used to utilize quite frequently for this information, and still do, but just in a more limited fashion because it's literally overwhelming now, the amount of information you can pull. So when you can actually look at this data in a number of different ways, I highly recommend if you're in this field, you take a look at that website if you haven't, because you can go pick a color code that shows what's accidental loss, what's by hacking, what's by insider attacks. Really, really interesting how they tweak the data. And that's not even their general focus. So it's just simply that they pull that data down and then present it for people to look at. So very interesting. But obviously the cyber attack problem is continuing to increase. Today when you talk to chief information security officers and chief information officers around the globe, they generally all agree for anywhere from mid-tier size companies, 10,000 and above, to large enterprises, Fortune 500 companies, and definitely decent-sized governments and government agencies that make up those governments, all agree that they're pretty continuously under attack, where somebody is trying to breach them, whether that's a nation-state adversary where they simply moved espionage activities online, so where it's cheaper and more asymmetric, so it's a lot easier to attack somebody you might not have in the past, to organized crime potentially doing deeds for nation states, so to organized crime or criminals that were former nation states that are in the underground, to criminals and organized crime utilizing nation state tools that have bled into the underground. That's a growing and dramatic problem, hence WannaCry, Petya, not Petya, and more problems from some of those leaks into the underground, to hacktivists that are also actually trying to compromise systems so that are sympathetic, with a specific thing that's happening somewhere around the globe. So lots of challenges. And by the way, I always like to point out here that this problem is going to get much worse than it is today. We literally have companies racing around the globe to actually get market penetration with new IoT devices, so new SCADA devices, primarily IoT in consumer and enterprise for that matter, so that generally have little consideration of cybersecurity being baked into the fabric. So many of them are not even, able to take updates. So which is going to be a dramatic problem for us. It's going to make this much worse than it is today. In fact, the other exacerbating factor is also the fact that many of those same manufacturers for IoT devices would like to utilize low-cost 5G chips as soon as it's available, and that 5G is being tested already, where we will have ubiquitous connectivity and mesh networks around the globe. That's obviously still a number of years out before that problem, raises its head, but nevertheless, we expect to see 5G nationwide in a number of nations, probably starting in 2019. So for smaller nations, and then probably over the next 2 to 3 years, really picking up speed. So this could be a significant challenge for us when we start to see anywhere from 20 to 25 billion interconnected devices, and many of them are small sensors connected to every facet of our homes and businesses that have little security baked in, and of course not inside your security perimeter because they will direct connect. So you think about the problem set today with the slide I'm showing right now, the problem's going to get much worse. Deception in the cyber realm. One more quote from Sun Tzu: all warfare is based upon deception. And as I stated earlier, if you talk to CIOs and CISOs at large companies and government organizations, they all say the same thing: we're continuously under attack. I'm not saying we're in a cyber war, but nevertheless, we are under attack. We've interconnected almost everything out there. So what is cyber deception? So deception is an active countermeasure used to overpower the cognitive processes of the adversary to induce errors in their thinking that a defender can exploit. So let's think about that today. The major challenge that we have is dwell time is too long. Mandiant did their 2018 report and stated on average around the globe, dwell time is 101 days. That's from the time an adversary breaks into your system, so until that breach is detected is 101 days. A really good red team can generally have domain credentials within 3 days. A relatively decent one, about a week to 10 days. So you think about how much time they have in your environment, and that's a significant issue. So deception is that system that you can put in a layered fashion across your entire environment that dramatically shrinks the dwell time. So, and if we think about that, that's what's critical. It's not that we get breached because we accept the fact today we're going to get breached. Everyone is getting breached. It's the fact that we mitigated the impact of that breach. A good example for me is you come home from a date and your front door has been kicked in of your house. So you show up, you call the police, and nothing's been stolen because the guy was still in the house, so ran out the back door, got away, but nevertheless, you showed up right after they broke into your house. So lesson learned, the impact pretty much mitigated. You have some cleanup to do because you need a new door, maybe you want to put an alarm system in, but nevertheless, they didn't steal anything that was critical to you or your family, and more importantly, no one in your family was harmed. So it's the same thing you're doing with cyber deception. You're putting a layer across your entire environment so to have an impact on that adversary inside the environment. It's literally you taking that environment back in your own hands and realizing the fact that you have your home field advantage, because that's your enterprise. So when an adversary breaks into a system, so they hit a credential, that credential may not be a real credential. It may take them to an Active Directory system inside a deceptive layer that's not real as well, but nevertheless validates that those credentials are not real. But as far as the adversary is concerned, it does validate them. So, they're playing there, and you've already gotten alarms as soon as they try to use those credentials across the board. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in this where suddenly you've moved pieces around inside the board and you've taken advantage of the fact that this is your environment, not the adversaries. Some of the other pieces people are starting to do in this now is they're also putting breadcrumbs and lures on the endpoints. So they're actually setting up fake applications as well, so they're deceptive applications. So if you're running a medical infusion pump at a hospital, you can actually set that up. If you're running health records, you could set that up. If you're part of the financial market infrastructure and running a SWIFT environment, you could actually emulate that and capture data from it. You can do IoT devices, point-of-sale devices, a whole bunch of things you can do in deception now. And you can also go in and set deeper levels of deception. So you can set up fake files and fake data at a deeper level. Maybe you want to have the CEO and the CFO and the head of engineering systems that respawn frequently. So these are decoys, not real ones, but nevertheless the adversary thinks it's real even if you placed fake information inside it. It's a tremendous amount you can do where literally you are doing taking home field advantage back of your enterprise. One of the things I think is really important is to look at this a little bit from the attacker's playbook. So when they come in, typically an attacker assumes he has time, unlimited attempts, and can move slowly through the network to avoid detection. And you hear that one a lot around industry across the board. So, well, we have to defend, 365, 24/7, no sleep in every single angle and every vector in our environment, where the adversary only has to find one tiny little chink in the armor to get in. And again, deception can give you that advantage back. So by actually mixing the network up where they don't know what is real and what isn't. So once they get in, they typically steal credentials from the endpoint. They move laterally and escalate privileges. I think anyone on this call playing in this space knows that when they start moving laterally, it's generally where they're inside your perimeter, and there's generally a lot less security controls to actually capture data on those adversaries at that point. And that's where another place where deception can be very, very strong and help you tremendously. So for that lateral movement, and as well when they steal credentials and they're sitting there listening and maybe trying to do a man in the middle as people are logging into shares, you can also capture that data on the deception side by providing fake information to them and alerting on it as well. The big point is once you implement deception, the adversary assumes all the information they found is real and the deceptive data is not expected. So a lot of fun you can do with that. We've got decoy documents as well that once they open those documents, even if they manage to get it, it still alerts you. So there's a tremendous amount you can do to try and drive change in this environment to be more successful. When you look at the attack sequence and methods, those detection gaps I was talking about, that adversary typically gathers intelligence. And at that point in time, you typically don't know generally, what the adversary is doing because they've not started that initial compromise at that point in time. And it may simply be intelligence they're gathering from documents you placed on the web, or doing recon on social media and a number of other avenues as well. But once they do that initial compromise, many of the things that they're doing, so inside those activities, they're using 0 days sometimes, stolen credentials, man-in-the-middle attacks, they're going after endpoint devices, especially BYOD devices, in phishing. So in the U.S. government, they do a FISMA report every year, always interesting reading, because their enterprise is so large. And just their DoD literally has, the Department of Defense has literally millions of endpoints. So phishing, that FISMA report is very interesting. It's a Federal Information Security Management Act. I reference that one because each year they come out and say the same thing, so that most of the successful breaches taking place are still from spear phishing emails going through. So you think about that. We've known about that for years, and that problem still isn't resolved because people like to click things. So I think gamification is another piece that's too broad a topic for this one, but nevertheless very important to look at for changing your environment. Once they're in and they've done that initial compromise, then they start their network recon. They start doing lateral movement. They look at their compromised credentials and try to gather more, again, more man-in-the-middle attacks. And they start doing active directory recon. And again, deception at this point in time can potentially uncover everything that's taking place and giving you a tremendous amount of counterintelligence on what the adversary is doing inside your environment. And at that point in time, you can decide, do I wish to entertain the adversary, or do I wish to actually just shut them off? And there's a lot of ways you can do that. With different types of devices, including, give them a bot sync, or actually, just shut them off and kick them out of your network. Once they get to the next phase, they generally are, of course, exfiltrating, stealing your data, or destroying data, or sabotaging systems. And at that point, generally we say they've completed the mission. But one of the scarier tactics I've seen over the years as well is when you find what potentially looks like an orphaned attack, where you found a system that was compromised. It looks like no one has been in that system for a number of years, and generally that may be a beachhead where somebody was waiting to come back in that environment. So if it's a nation state, potentially for sabotage or exfiltrating additional data down the line. Or on the corporate side, waiting for you to finish some research and development and steal that so they don't have to do that research and development. There are a number of things that can happen at that point in time. So I'm going to pause for a second. We have a question from the audience here. How do you think deceptive data, if breached and leaked, work with the GDPR accuracy requirement? So it's a very interesting question. And I think that it depends on what type of deception you're layering across your environment. Obviously, you would want to talk to your data experts and privacy officers in your environment on what data you're placing inside your deceptive environment. But these are simply put for a good layer of deception across the environment. They're your own gold images that you can incorporate. So it's your own data that you have already. And since you're alerted as soon as they touch that, you could set it up so no data is exfiltrated out of that environment. So there's a lot of different routes that you can take, to counter that. But again, it's not like you're specifically creating data so that could be potentially impactful to your own organization if it's stolen. So you could take, fake PII information that relates back to no one and input it as decoy documents in there. So, and then, no GDPR challenges there because all of the documents are not real, not relatable back to any EU citizen. So there's a lot of different paths you could take down that. But good question, thank you. So as this slide builds out, I think one of the interesting things that we need to look at is how does deception, close the detection deficit? We've seen over the last 20 years, and quite literally, most of this is industry's fault, where everyone's, and the analysts as well, that have talked about best of breed. Buy best of breed. Don't actually rely on the same technology stack from one vendor across your environment. And that's literally led to massive challenges where everybody's put a ton of preventative solutions in place that have just overwhelmed analysts in large security operations centers. In fact, you can quite often look at the attrition rate inside a SOC and tell, that they may have a bad security stack that's overwhelming those analysts if the attrition rate is high inside just that organization. And after a while, analysts get fried if that problem doesn't get fixed and they leave. So it's really interesting. And what we're trying to get people to start thinking about is everyone admits that sooner or later they'll get breached. So why aren't you spending more on the preventative or the detection side if the preventative solutions are not working, 100% of the time? And obviously they're not. Go back to that information is beautiful slide deck I just went through. So we need to actually close the detection deficit, to be more successful in this space. So today the challenge is, is lateral movement threat detection. Simply put, the adversary gets in, and most organizations have very little in that space to actually detect what's going on as they move across your environment. So if you put deception in place, you can actually do detection for in-network recon, credential harvesting, and slowing of the attack. The credential theft-based attack challenge, you can actually do detection on the endpoint and domain credential theft and attack path visibility. And that's really important. One that's not talked about a lot is providing that attack path visibility. In other words, you and I shared a file across two different systems. I got fired and left. And what we don't realize is those credentials, even if we shut things down, so those credentials may still be in memory, may still be there. So, and one of the things that some good deception solutions can do is actually show you how an adversary, if they steal this credential, how they could move across the environment by mapping that to other credentials or other shares. Pretty interesting. Ransomware, we know that's a big problem across the board. So deception solutions have been known to stop ransomware in its tracks. So, and stop the impact, even though the breach happens, but nevertheless, so it's immediately detected. So as soon as it hits anything deceptive in the environment, and you're able to actually mitigate the impact from that. So, and you can also slow the attacks. There's a lot of ways to slow down, what an adversary is trying to do, and you can literally toy with them. As I've heard some people say, how much do you want to entertain the adversary? So it can be quite fun. If you've got the skill set and the time for that, if not, you can just set it up to shut them down. The evolving attack surface, it's a major challenge. We talked about that a few minutes ago with just IoT and 5G, let alone, the other sensors that are coming to everything, the SCADA systems getting interconnected. This problem is going to continue to grow. Go to any tech person's area at work or desk at home, and you find it littered, with devices, and many of them still connected. But again, we're getting SCADA, IoT, point of sale, Swift, telecom, router decoys, AWS, Azure, OpenStack are some of the things that you can layer into a deception solution or utilize on the cloud perspective. So if you have those, so doing it on site or in the cloud to counter those. One of the challenges, of course, is compliance, breach investigation, and M&A visibility. M&A visibility is one I've had a lot of CEOs bring to my attention and want to discuss with me, and quite often even at the board level. And it's where they buy a company, and how do they do thorough validation that the company that they bought is not breached before they start interconnecting systems. We found a lot of people are looking at deception to use for M&A visibility. Drop it out there and see if the adversary starts looking at that environment that's already inside there. So I still recommend red teaming as well. but nevertheless, deception can also be very, very helpful before you connect a company's acquired assets to your own. Skill shortage and ability to respond to incident. So this one thing that's really interesting. I've heard some folks say that, well, it's too early for deception. I have to work on the basics. So, and one thing that I've seen is that a lot of organizations can quickly mature their capabilities simply by deploying deception across their environment, because suddenly the alert fatigue challenge is gone, because these are high fidelity alerts generally in a well laid out deception system. So because those alerts mean something, because no one should be touching that environment. By that I mean, if someone touches one of these decoys or deceptive credential, so let's face it, what user should be scraping memory if it's a real system, right? They should not be if it's got a deceptive credential inside it. So, but it's generally somebody that's broken into your perimeter that sets off one of these alerts, a malicious insider that sets off one of those alerts, or somebody actually that's violating policy, doing things they shouldn't be doing. Maybe they're not planning to sell anything or do any damage to the company, but nevertheless in direct violation of policies. So, and occasionally, you do have a system that blows up that may cause these systems to be touched by, maybe it blows up and just starts chattering across the network to everything. So deceptive systems can be set up to actually white label scanning tools so they don't respond to them. There's a lot of different things you can do to make sure those alerts are very high fidelity alerts. So somebody sent a question. It's a really good question. I like that one. So let me respond to that before we move on. So, and that's, given the issues with the Macron hack before the French elections, I worry that letting the threat actor exfiltrate any data, even if false, gives them plausibility if they then use that data mixed with their own disinformation files. Any thoughts? So that's a really great question. So, and that would be a challenge. Absolutely it would be. So I think what we have to do is we have to look at the fact that implementing deception, so in a good layer across your environment, so does not increase any chances of you getting compromised. So now you potentially have the capability to ensure what data would get leaked, so because what's in your deceptive layer that you put out there versus your own environment. So a good deceptive layer should immediately lead them to decoys where you've controlled what data is inside those versus them actually attacking other systems out there so that you don't control what data is on it. You don't control what data, the CEO has on his system or the president of your company has on his system. Obviously you don't, but nevertheless you do control what's in that decoy environment. So could it be a challenge? Absolutely. No solution's perfect. If you have any vendor telling you they have a perfect solution, chuck them out the door, because nothing is perfect. But nevertheless, this puts you in control. As I stated earlier, you suddenly have taken home field advantage back inside your enterprise. So, and if you'd like to dive deeper on that question, it's a really good one. Please reach out. At the end, Tom's going to provide some contact information. But again, deception closes that detection gap, and that's really, really important to shrink that dwell time because that's very impactful. Here's an interesting one. This quote was just a little bit earlier this year, so in the Mirror, so in the UK. So cyber deception is needed, and this was by Air Marshal Phil Osborne from the MOD. So cyber attacks against national infrastructure and reputation across Europe, information operations that attempt to pervert political process and frustrate the rule of law, and attempted assassinations. Deception and counter-deception operations will be critical in dealing with such threats. And it's really interesting that you still have conversations with folks that are hesitant to think about deception in an environment that's attacked continuously, when nevertheless it's been one of the most successful strategies across the board, in physical conflict. So even today, in fisticuffs, so nevertheless, deception is often used. So, and it's something we're not thinking about utilizing as an avenue to defend our enterprise environments, which is, in my opinion, a little short-sighted on our part. So I think that it's something that more organizations should consider. In the commercial world, it's growing rapidly, and it's starting to gain traction in government as well as they start to realize this. Here's another quote I really like. By the way, I should have had the link up there for a video as well. There's a video on YouTube for this. If you search for it, you'll find it easily. And this is Rob Joyce, who was the White House cybersecurity czar in the United States, who before that was the NSA Tailored Access Operations leader. If you're not familiar with that organization, they're pretty famous. That's the one that, literally does exactly what he said his title is. But anyway, Rob spoke at the USNIC's Enigma conference in 2016, and he was giving recommendations on how to keep NSA and other nation states out of your environment. How do you make it more difficult for them? And one of the things he stated was another nightmare for the NSA, an out-of-band network tap, a device that monitors network activity and produces logs that can record anomalous activity, plus a smart system administrator who actually reads the logs and pays attention to what they say. So you think about that. So that's exactly what deception is. I talked about the high-fidelity alerts, and by the definition itself, any activity inside a deceptive layer is anomalous activity, and you must respond to it. So you're literally putting the power back in your own hands to succeed in this space. So again, home field advantage, something that every sporting fan knows, and yet we don't utilize near enough inside our own enterprise environment. We own it, they don't. That's all I have at this point. Unless there are any more questions, I will turn it back over to you, Tom.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that, Tony. I think we are all out of questions. You do still have some time if you would like to ask them, however, as I run through the final few bits. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you would like to download any information about the TiVo networks, you can find it under the attachments heading. Likewise, if you would like to have a chat with any of the TiVo team or send across an email to Tony, you'll find it on the announcements that have just been pushed around. You've got email addresses there and even a phone number. So do feel free to give them a shout and discuss what you'd like to. Other than that, thank you so much for coming to join us, Tony. I do hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
I did. It was a lot of fun, and thank you everyone that attended and that listens in the future. I appreciate it, and look forward to meeting you in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.